The Synoptic Gospels, the life and teachings of Christ, presented by Jonathan Robinson. What are the Synoptic Gospels? They are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason that they are called synoptic or same-seeing is because they agree on many things and share much of the same content based on their plot, their style of writing, and the way they present the deeds of Jesus himself. And they all sync up, or same seeing, whereas they differ from the book of John, who has about 90% of unique content that is unique to his own gospel that is not found in either Mark, Matthew, or Luke. Who wrote them? The Synoptic Gospels were written by three authors: Matthew, who was an eyewitness to the events of Christ; Mark, who was not an eyewitness, but was a disciple of Peter, who was an eyewitness, and everything Peter taught Mark, he wrote down, so it was a second-hand eyewitness account. And then Luke, who was also not an eyewitness, was a companion of Paul, and both Paul and Luke had ample time to interview actual eyewitnesses to gather information when writing down their respected works and their knowledge of Christ. And Luke was also a Gentile convert. When were they written? The book of Mark was believed to be written sometime between AD 55 and AD 70. Most scholars today believe in Mark in priority, or they believe that Mark was the first penned gospel. Matthew. Matthew is believed to have been written between 50 and 70 AD. This used to be the favored first penned gospel. Most of the early church generally believed that Matthew was the first penned gospel, but as time went on, debate started happening on whether or not Matthew really was the first gospel, and there's still much debate between if it was Matthew or if it was Mark, but most people now seem to take Mark in priority over Matthew, but it's not a settled matter, and it probably will never be a settled matter. And then Luke. Now, Luke has the least concrete dating of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, while all of these are estimations, both Mark and Matthew give time frames of when they were written, at least giving a start date, as it had to be between this time and that time. Luke only gives it had to be before this time, and that time was sometime before AD 62. And that is because of these events here. The death of James, which also occurred in AD 62, the death of Paul, which occurred in AD 64, and the death of Peter, which occurred in AD 65. Now, the reason people or scholars believe that Luke had to be written sometime before AD 62 was because Luke not only wrote the book of Luke, but he wrote the book of Acts. And while none of these people would have died before the book of Acts, many believe that if they had died during Luke writing the book of Acts, he would have recorded their deaths, as they were significant early followers of the faith, Peter even being an eyewitness to the events of Jesus, James being the brother of Jesus, and Paul being one of Luke's close friends and someone he worked very closely with. So the reason they believe that Luke is written before AD 62 is they strongly believe if any of these men had died before Luke penned his gospel and the book of Acts, then he would have recorded such events in the book of Acts, but he did not. And then as to why all the dates have to be sometime before AD 70 was because of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. Now this is significant because the temple being destroyed was a significant event that was prophesied by Jesus himself. And the event happened exactly as Jesus said it would happen, saying that no stone would be left upon another that would not be torn down. See, when the Romans sacked the temple in Jerusalem, the fires melted the gold within the temple and it got in between the walls. So to ensure that they were able to get all of the gold out of the walls, the Romans actually tore down the temple brick by brick, stone by stone, ensuring that they would indeed get all the gold that was within the temple. And many people believe that if such a significant event happened and such a prophecy that happens to such pinpoint accuracy that Jesus described, they would have most assuredly put it in the Gospels to once again be further proof that Jesus was who he said he was. To conclude, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all sync up, hence the term synoptic, were written by trustworthy sources, either eyewitnesses to the events of Christ or people who had direct contact with the eyewitnesses of Christ. And lastly, they were written within the lifetime of those said eyewitness accounts, so we know that the Synoptic Gospels, like all of the Bible, is trustworthy and worthy of being taught.